Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, September 15th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a brand new poll out of the state of Iowa, one of the most reputable pollsters in this battleground state, and I say battleground state hesitantly because I haven't really seen it as such up until this brand new poll from an A-plus rated pollster done by the Des Moines Register and Ann Salter, who combined have accurately predicted multiple elections in years past, giving us a general understanding of how Iowa politics is really come to understood in the polling firm and really giving us a heads up as to how an election might end up. Now, the recent election poll was back in 2022 when they predicted that incumbent Senator Chuck Grassley was going to win by roughly 12 points across the state. Chuck Grassley and the Republican Party invested a lot of money in the final stretch of the campaign because of an initial poll that was done by the Des Moines Register that had shown that we had seen Michael Franken end up narrowing up that race quite significantly in a way that Republicans were really worried about. And it provided a bit of context in comparison to previous elections that Chuck Grassley had ran in, indicating that the 2022 midterms might not be all that good for Republicans as they early on seemed prior to the Dobbs decision. Back in 2020, you might also be surprised to see that the Des Moines Register and Ann Salter ended up getting it nearly spot on in 2020 and predicting that Donald Trump would win by 7 points. The polling average without the Des Moines Register poll and Ann Salter had a number here of Trump being up by just around a percentage point. They were the only major pollster out there that said that Donald Trump would win by roughly 7 points, and roughly 7 points was his margin of victory, an 8.2% actual margin that was well within the margin of error of 3.4%. But their track record isn't just accurate from 2022, where it was spot on, 12 points to 12.1, or 2020 was off by just a singular point, 7 to 8. It was right in 2016, and it correctly predicted that Donald Trump would win across the state by a much larger margin than many people had expected. Hillary Clinton was neck and neck in the final stretch of the polls until that final poll was released from Ann Salter showing Donald Trump with a 7-point advantage, again mimicking the exact number that he received back in 2020, but in 2016 it ended up being even more accurate, again because no other pollster had indicated that a victory such as this would come through, except for a Monmouth University poll that was released that showed Donald Trump with an 8-point advantage all the way back in early September. And so it was the last major poll that was conducted in Iowa that got 2016 right. And it is one thing to get 2016 right, but also to get 2020 and 2022 right is something to note as well. And even beyond that point, it isn't just 2022 or 2020 or 2016. You can even go back to 2012 when we see that Obama was predicted a 5-point margin of victory. What did he win by? 5.8%, outperforming the average here in the state of Iowa and predicted by the same firm and the same person. And then going back even further to a race that was actually a much harder to predict earlier on, we saw here that Barack Obama was predicted to win the Iowa Democratic Caucus. Caucuses are really hard to poll in the modern era, but back in 2008, the average here had Obama up by just 1.6%. Some of the polling groups actually had Hillary Clinton up by 2, Hillary Clinton up by 9, but what the Des Moines Register came up with was that Obama would win by 7. It was an outlier. It was the largest lead for Obama that was polled in the state of Iowa, and yet he won by 7.8. And so when you take a look at their track record from 2008 to 2012 to 2016 to 2020 to 2022, you start to see why this poll in particular is regarded as one of the best across the state of Iowa. And now you might be thinking, okay, is this an outlier? Do Republicans actually trust this poll even with its historical accuracy? But the answer to that is yes. Republicans have never been the ones to cite polls as their major movers unless they are partisan polls. Rasmussen reports, Insider Advantage, Trafalgar. These are the polls that Donald Trump and his Make America Great Again surrogates love to put up to the mainstream media, love to put up on Truth Social and on Twitter and on Instagram and TikTok. They go across and wide with many of these polls, but the Des Moines Register hasn't always been one that we've really started to see brought back up into circulation until a recent poll they conducted back in June, where it showed Donald Trump with a whopping 18-point advantage over Joe Biden in a head-to-head matchup, in a multi-way matchup with many other candidates in consideration. Joe Biden received just 32% of voters in the state of Iowa. Donald Trump with a massive 50%, an 18-point delta between him and Joe Biden. The former president, Donald Trump, did really well in this first set of polls. It was a really good start, and it came at a time, too, where Democrats were hoping going straight into that presidential debate that would be the reason they could turn around the election. But very clearly, at that presidential debate, Democrats did not do well. Joe Biden had to eventually drop out of the presidential race due to the fallout from that first and only presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. But the Des Moines Register and Ann Seltzer combined, showing this 18-point advantage rang the alarm bells like beyond belief for the Democratic Party. Because of their historical accuracy, they believed that it indicated a larger shift and movement away from the incumbent president and away from the Democratic Party. And this is something that we largely saw pretty consistently across the battleground states. Donald Trump was doing far better than he did in 2020 in the polls in many of these states. But now, this 18-point advantage has been reduced to just a 4-point lead in the poll that was released today, in a massive, massive shock to the Republican Party. When this poll was being paraded around as something that was going to be released today, the Republican media and Donald Trump surrogates took immediately to social media to say and set benchmarks for themselves when it came down to this poll. What they had said, and you can see this all across multiple conservative media, reporters, pundits, etc., saying that if it was anywhere between 8 to 10 points, they'd be happy with that poll because it would raise a little bit of an alarm bell, but they'd be largely happy. They'd still be winning Iowa by a large amount. You know, if it was anywhere from 11 to 14 points, it'd be saying that they'd be winning this election pretty easily. Anything above that, similar to what they saw back in this poll against Joe Biden, they knew the election was wraps. But they never once considered a possibility that they would be leading by anything less than 8 points. Never anything less than what was just on par with the 2020 election, given that Iowa has seen pretty much a rightward trend in every election since the 2012 election, including midterm races. It was 9 points in 2016, roughly similar in 2020, 12 points in 2022, and the 2024 data hadn't been super well gauged, but the one that was done back in June showed an 18-point advantage. And so they expected some level of reduction, sure. Taking 18 down to 14 does show that Kamala Harris gained about 4 points across the nation, but what they are suggesting here is that Kamala Harris has taken what was an 18-point lead for Trump and narrowed it down to just 4 points. And so now Republicans are trying to say this poll is completely inaccurate. They're trying to completely flip the script on this and say, we don't trust it. It is just an outlier. Aren't they always wrong? Right? This is something that I think we've seen directly out of the former president's playbook in shoving away data points and shoving away very clearly high-quality polls that tell us stories about an election. I would understand that an 18-point margin of victory is something that we can look at and say this probably isn't happening, and I think that's entirely reasonable. I do think it was very possible for Donald Trump to win in this state by double digits, 11, 12 points, depending on how poor Joe Biden performed, but 18 points wasn't really within heavy consideration, and I do think it's right in saying that RFK Jr. probably wasn't getting 9% of the vote across the state, and neither was the Libertarian candidate Chase Oliver getting 2% across the state. We were probably seeing more minuscule results there, and Donald Trump, if he's winning by 18, is certainly not getting only 50% of the vote, right? He's going to get 53, 54, 55% of the vote, if not more, in a scenario where he's winning by this much. So against Kamala Harris, what we found here is that it has reduced to Donald Trump being at 47, Kamala Harris at 43. The interesting thing, too, RFK Jr. is still on the ballot in Iowa, and voters are still voting for him in the state of Iowa. I still expect this margin of victory for Donald Trump in November to be larger than 4 points in Iowa. But I want us to really understand what this means right now for the current state of the race. Now, this poll was conducted before the presidential debate. Around the time, I believe it was actually fielded in the state of Iowa the day before the debate, through the debate, and the day after the debate. And so it's a mix of results here. But overall, right, it launched before the debate. On September 8th, the debate was on September 10th. So actually about 2 days, 1 day of debate, and then 1 day after. Overall, though, not really a post-debate poll. But what it does show is that even before that debate, voters were in a position where they're a lot more open to the idea of a Kamala Harris presidency. Even if the majority of voters are not necessarily picking her, they aren't picking Donald Trump either. And again, with this super strong accuracy in terms of how they have predicted elections from 2008 to 2012 to 2016 to 2020 to 2022, it is alarming, to say the least, to Republicans that what was an 18-point lead has narrowed down to 4, even in a pre-debate poll, which could argue that a post-debate poll would do even better. Now, Ann Seltzer and the Des Moines Register do not release these polls every week or every day. Like we've seen Rasmussen Reports, they do a daily tracker. We've seen other firms do weekly polls. That's not how they do these things. And so the next time we'll really get a high-quality poll will probably be in around a month from now, which puts us around the time of the election, and they'll probably release one right before the election. But as of now, this is our only data point in the state of Iowa, and it actually is a very fascinating one. I want us to really understand what this actually means when it comes down to a 4-point advantage for Donald Trump in the state of Iowa, because I want to take a look at what an electoral map would look like with a universal shift given the data points we're getting out of Iowa. Now, I will say this, I don't think that's going to be the case. I don't think we're in a position where, because Iowa's 4 points, it means that every other state's going to be shifting by the exact amount. But keep in mind, back in 2020, this is a state that we saw Democrats lose to Donald Trump by nearly 9 points. And so you're talking about at least a 4-point shift. And for the sake of giving Republicans some level of support, we're going to say a 4-point shift is really fair to look at it this way. This is, of course, not my prediction, but just humoring it for a moment to really understand why this is a bad position for Republicans. And so with a 4-point advantage for the Democratic Party based on the 2020 numbers, what it does, it turns states like Colorado into safe blue, makes some states even more likely for the Democratic Party, states like New Hampshire and Minnesota and Virginia and New Mexico. And what it also does, too, to some of these battleground states, it doesn't mean Democrats win Iowa. Of course, they're down in Iowa. It doesn't mean they win Ohio. But what it does mean is they win states like Florida very narrowly. It means they win states like North Carolina. It means they win states like Georgia. They win states like Pennsylvania by likely margins. They win Michigan by a likely margin. They win Wisconsin, right? They're winning in Maine's 1st district and Maine at large by safe margins. They're winning in Nebraska's 2nd by likely margins. They're winning in Arizona. They're winning in Nevada by a likely margin. This shift across the country does really good things for the Democratic Party, and that's why this should really concern Republicans. Because it means here, if they're working in a scenario like this is the electoral map they're working with. They're working with one that is, far less likely to vote for the Republican Party, just simply based on what this national shift shows, that, Republicans just don't seem to be winning it in the same way they used to. Don't seem to be winning Iowa in the same way they used to. It would make Ohio a likely state, right? And that's not things Republicans want. And so when we're taking a look, too, at our national standpoint here, this is what Ann Seltzer essentially would be predicting, assuming a universal shift nationwide. What we know is this country doesn't work that way. It's not as simple, right? The country isn't shifting 5 points to the left compared to the last election, or 4 points to the left compared to the last election. That's not really what we've been seeing. In fact, in some cases, Kamala Harris has been underperforming Joe Biden's performance, and in some cases, outperforming, but never by 4 points across the state. It is just a data point in a wide range of data points, but it's a very accurate one with a really strong track record, which means Republicans need to get something together. It also could be a regional thing. We've started to see data points out of Wisconsin showing Kamala Harris with 3 4-point leads in this state. Why does that matter? Joe Biden only won Wisconsin by under a percentage point, right? So if Wisconsin's 3-4 points, and you're seeing that shift roughly 3 to 4 points to the left, it would make sense maybe that Iowa is doing the same. That this Midwestern appeal and this approach to Omaha and the Wisconsin region is having an impact on voters in the state of Iowa and doing outreach to a state indirectly that Democrats aren't investing in as much as they did in 2008, 2012, or 2016. And so I'd be interested to see if maybe that's part of the driving factor here. But overall here, what we are finding is that Kamala Harris is outperforming Joe Biden's performance in Iowa, outperforming Hillary Clinton's performance in Iowa, and that baseline is doing far better than many Democrats would even be doing at this point, and far, far, far better than where Joe Biden was back in June. It is just a thought that really I haven't been able to wrap my mind around, that this 18-point advantage has been reduced down to just 4. Now again, I will say this. If RFK Jr. is at 6%, I can imagine that when voters start shifting away from him, which will probably happen with more education around his dropout and who he endorsed, that about 2/3 of these voters will go to Donald Trump, which means I believe undeniably he at least wins a majority of the votes in the state. But if 1/3 of the voters are going to Kamala Harris, it boosts her numbers up, and she could do better than both Biden and Clinton, which again helps indicate us, helps drive us in terms of understanding how many other battleground states will go as well. I think when push comes to shove, what we will find in the final poll here is that Donald Trump will be up by roughly 5 or 6 points. A victory regardless, but 5 or 6 points is a bit tame for Donald Trump when he's winning this state in 2016 by 9.4 and in 2020 by 8.1, right? And so a reduction here means there's probably a more universal reduction nationwide, a reduction in support in states like Wisconsin, a reduction in support in states like Michigan and in Pennsylvania. And I think this poll really displays that we might be on path to see that. It would be really naive to assume that 100% of these RFK Jr. voters are going to Donald Trump, even with that endorsement. I mean, that really doesn't make much of a difference. And assuming that they do too, assuming every other voting base here, not sure, would not vote, someone else, Chase Oliver, RFK Jr., assuming all of them move over to Trump, what it puts him in is in a position where he could end up winning this state by double digits, but it doesn't mean the Democrats are seeing 10-point shifts across the nation. What the poll from June showed was that we could have been seeing that, right? An 8-point margin turned into 18. Now, at most, you're seeing just a few point shifts across these battleground states, and arguably, too, if it isn't something that is in fact universal, maybe it doesn't mean everything. But at this point, I will say, I take this Iowa poll as just one piece of the puzzle in understanding the Midwestern region of the United States, and what we have seen consistently out of data from states like Michigan and parts of Pennsylvania that would be considered Midwestern, and states like Wisconsin and Minnesota. The numbers there don't look too promising for Donald Trump. They look better than they have before, but they don't look too promising. And this Iowa number really hammers that in as one of the most respected pollsters in the nation, who has gotten this right year after year after year, election after election after election, is saying Donald Trump's support and lead has been cut down from 18% down to just 4%, with just 50 days to go. And Republicans should be worried. They won't lose Iowa, but it might be an indicator they might lose much more. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, this video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.